When Helen, a longtime resident, confronts Marcus, a quiet neighbor she assumes doesn't belong, she has no idea that he's actually the building's owner. Her prejudice sets off a chain of events that forces everyone in their community to face uncomfortable truths. Marcus, determined to create a space where everyone feels welcome, offers Helen an unexpected choice that could change everything. As tensions rise and old habits are challenged, Helen's journey from isolation to understanding will make you wonder, can a person really change? And what does it take to rebuild trust? Hit subscribe and ring the notification bell to follow this powerful story of redemption, community, and hope. Let us know in the comments. Do you believe in second chances? Get ready to dive into a story that just might change the way you see the world. The building at 127 Maple Avenue had stood for nearly a century, a relic of Boston's storied past. Its brick facade was weathered but strong, rising 5 stories above a tree-lined street in a neighborhood where cobblestones still marked the intersections. Originally a grand mansion built by a wealthy shipping magnate, the building had since been divided into apartments, each with its own quirks and charms. High ceilings, worn wooden floors, and fireplaces that hadn't worked in decades, but added a touch of nostalgia. Inside, the lobby held the echoes of another era. A marble staircase spiraled up from the entryway, the banister polished by decades of hands. A chandelier, missing a few crystals but still elegant, cast soft light over the checkered tile floor. The lobby was always cool, no matter the season, the thick walls held in the memory of winters past. Along one wall, a series of brass mailboxes stood, each door labeled with the tenants' names. The building had long been a place where different worlds intersected. There were the old-timers, residents like Richard Young, who had lived in his third-floor apartment since the 1980s, and Mrs. Bennett, an elderly widow who had seen the neighborhood transform around her. And there were newer arrivals like Clara Martinez, a single mother who worked long shifts at a local hospital, and Josh, a software developer who split his time between Boston and the West Coast. Each tenant brought a piece of their life into the building, filling the hallways with the scent of home-cooked meals, the murmur of conversations, and the occasional sound of a child's laughter. Marcus Davis, a man in his early 40s, moved through these spaces with a quiet presence. He had lived in the building for 3 years, but many of the tenants knew little about him beyond polite nods in the hallway and occasional small talk. He liked it that way. Marcus was careful about what he shared, preferring to observe from a distance rather than reveal too much of himself. To the residents, Marcus was simply a calm, unassuming neighbor, someone who fixed a leaky faucet for Mrs. Bennett when she asked, or who helped Clara carry groceries up the stairs when the elevator broke down. What they didn't know, and what he chose not to broadcast, was that Marcus owned the building. He had bought it after a successful run in the tech industry, deciding to invest in the city where he'd grown up. For him, 127 Maple wasn't just a property, it was a chance to build something different, a place where people from different backgrounds could live side by side, learning to see each other as more than stereotypes or strangers. Marcus had grown up in Boston's Roxbury neighborhood, in a time when the city was marked by deep racial and economic divides. He had spent his youth navigating those divisions, learning to read the subtle cues that signaled whether a place was welcoming or hostile. He knew what it felt like to be treated as if he didn't belong, and he had vowed that if he ever had the chance, he would create spaces where others didn't have to feel that way. But even with all his plans, Marcus knew that change came slowly. Some residents, like Clara, had quickly embraced the community spirit he tried to foster, joining neighborhood events and reaching out to others. But there were others, like Helen Turner, who held on to old ways of thinking, people who saw difference as a threat, not an opportunity. Marcus had crossed paths with Helen often enough to know her type. She had moved into the building a decade ago, back when gentrification was beginning to reshape the neighborhood. To her, the building was a symbol of a better time, a place where the right kind of people lived, where tradition was respected, and where certain boundaries remained unchallenged. She was in her late 50s with meticulously styled hair and a wardrobe that suggested she cared about appearances. Her apartment, a corner unit with a view of the city park, was filled with antique furniture and framed photographs from another era. Marcus knew that Helen looked at him and saw only a part of the picture. saw the casual clothes, the quiet demeanor, the skin that didn't match her idea of who belonged in places like this. And he knew that one day those assumptions would come to the head. He just didn't know how soon that moment would come. It was a crisp morning in early November, the air sharp with the promise of winter. The trees lining Maple Avenue had lost most of their leaves, which now skittered across the pavement in dry whispers. Marcus descended the stairs from his penthouse apartment, enjoying the quiet of the early hours. The lobby was empty, save for the faint hum of the building's old boiler, chugging to life with the season's first chills. He moved toward the mailboxes, reaching for the key in his pocket. The routine was familiar, checking for bills, advertisements, and the occasional letter from friends he'd stayed in touch with over the years. As he sorted through the mail, the building's front door creaked open, and Helen Turner stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She was dressed in her usual attire, well-tailored slacks, a wool coat, and a scarf wrapped neatly around her neck. She spotted Marcus almost immediately, her expression tightening as if she had caught him in the middle of something improper. For a moment she hovered near the door, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of him standing there, casually dressed in jeans and a button-down shirt. "Excuse me," she said, her tone clipped. Marcus glanced over his shoulder and nodded politely, continuing to sort through his letters. But Helen didn't move. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes darting to the mailbox and then back to Marcus's face. "Do you need something?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to cut through the silence of the lobby. Marcus turned to face her fully, sensing the tension in her stance. "Just checking my mail," he replied, his voice steady and neutral. He had encountered people like Helen before, people who demanded explanations for his presence in places where they felt he didn't belong. He'd learned long ago that responding with calmness often unsettled them more than any display of anger. Helen's eyes narrowed further, a scowl pulling at the corners of her mouth. "I don't recognize you," she said, her gaze sweeping over him with open suspicion. "And I think I know most of the residents here." Marcus watched as she crossed her arms, her posture growing more rigid. He saw the assumptions in her eyes, saw her trying to fit him into a box. In her mind, he wasn't a tenant. He was an outsider, someone who didn't belong in her carefully curated world. "I live here," Marcus replied, keeping his voice calm. "Been here a while now." Helen gave a thin, disbelieving smile. "Is that so?" she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Well, I think you're mistaken. Or maybe you've wandered into the wrong building. We don't usually have people just hanging around the lobby." Her words stung, even though Marcus had long learned to let such barbs slide off him. He glanced down at the letters in his hand, then backed up at Helen, choosing to remain silent for a moment. He could see arrogance in her eyes, the way she was bracing herself for a confrontation she assumed she would win. "I suggest you leave," Helen continued, her voice growing colder. "Or I'll have to call security. They can sort this out." Marcus felt a flicker of frustration, but he held it in check. "You can call them if you'd like," he said, his tone even, "but I think you'll find you're the one who's mistaken." For a moment, the lobby was silent, except for the distant rumble of the boiler. Helen's face flushed with anger, her jaw tightening as she reached into her handbag for her phone. "We'll see about that," she snapped, turning on her heel and striding toward the security desk near the back of the lobby. Marcus watched her go, feeling a sense of weariness settle over him. He had hoped that this kind of confrontation could be avoided, that he could change the building's culture without drawing attention to himself. But now, as Helen made her call to security, he realized that some battles couldn't be sidestepped. He slid the rest of his mail into his pocket and leaned against the banister, waiting for the inevitable scene to unfold. Helen returned minutes later, accompanied by George Whitaker, the building's longtime security guard. George was a burly man in his 50s, with a face weathered by years of late-night shifts in a thick Boston accent. He had been hired by Marcus shortly after the purchase of the building, and while he knew most of the residents by name, he had a special respect for Marcus, though he had kept his employer's ownership a quiet secret. George's confusion was clear as he followed Helen toward the lobby. She spoke to him in a low, insistent tone, gesturing angrily in Marcus's direction. "I found him loitering near the mailboxes," she hissed. "You need to get him out of here." As they approached, Marcus gave George a small, knowing nod. George's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition passing across his face. He hesitated, then cleared his throat, glancing awkwardly between Helen and Marcus. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he began, scratching the back of his head. "Mr. Davis, here. He's actually the owner of the building." Helen froze, the color draining from her face. She stared at George as if he had spoken a foreign language, her mind struggling to grasp the words. "The owner?" she repeated, her voice faltering. "You must be mistaken. He's just a tenant, isn't he?" George shifted uncomfortably, looking to Marcus for guidance. Marcus met Helen's bewildered gaze, his expression composed. "No mistake," he said softly. "I own the building, Helen. Every part of it." Helen's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She felt as though the floor had dropped out from under her, leaving her floundering in a void of shock and disbelief. All her assumptions, the sense of superiority she had carried into the confrontation, now turned against her, exposing the depth of her error. She glanced at George, seeking some kind of validation, but the security guard only looked away, as if embarrassed by her. The silence stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable, until Helen found her voice again, though it came out as a harsh whisper. I didn't know," she stammered, her bravado crumbling. You thought I didn't belong," Marcus finished for her, his voice steady but carrying an edge that Helen hadn't heard before. "You thought you knew everything there was to know about me, based on how I look." Helen swallowed hard, the heat rising to her face. She wanted to defend herself, to find some way to salvage her pride, but the words stuck in her throat. In that moment, she realized that there was no defense, no excuse that would change the reality she was now facing. Without another word, she turned and fled toward the elevator, her footsteps echoing through the lobby as she retreated. Marcus watched her go, feeling a mixture of emotions. Anger, yes, but also a deep sense of sadness. He had wanted to change this place for the better, to build a community where people like Helen might learn to see beyond their own prejudices. But now he wondered if he had been naive, if such change was even possible. He glanced at George, who gave him an awkward but sympathetic nod. "Sorry about that, Mr. Davis. Some people just don't know how to mind their own business." "It's all right, George," Marcus replied, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. "Thank you for handling things." With a final nod, George returned to his desk, and Marcus turned back toward the stairs, feeling the weight of the morning settle heavily on his shoulders. He knew that this confrontation was just the beginning, that Helen's actions had set something in motion that couldn't be easily undone. And as he climbed back toward his apartment, he began to consider how he might use this moment to push for a deeper change, not just in Helen, but in the entire building. Back in his penthouse apartment, Marcus leaned against the windowsill, staring out over the city. The skyline was dotted with high-rises, each one casting long shadows over the narrow streets below. He had always loved Boston's mix of old and new, the way history lingered alongside modernity, sometimes harmonious, sometimes clashing. He had thought he could create a little version of that balance here at 127 Maple, but now he wondered if he had underestimated the depth of the city's scars. He opened his laptop and began drafting an email to his lawyer, reviewing the changes he wanted to make to the building's rules and the upcoming meeting he planned to hold. He didn't want to embarrass Helen publicly, but he knew that what had happened today needed to be addressed in a way that made clear to everyone that prejudice would not be tolerated here. As he typed, memories of his own past came rushing back. Moments from his childhood when he'd been told he didn't belong, when store clerks had followed him down aisles, when neighbors had questioned his right to be in certain parts of town. Those experiences had left their mark on him, shaping the way he moved through the world, the way he saw others. He thought about the residents he had come to know in this building, each carrying their own stories and struggles. He thought about Clara, trying to raise her daughter in a world that often felt stacked against her, and about Mrs. Bennett, who had seen the neighborhood change so many times that she had learned to embrace each new wave of residents. And he thought about Helen, retreating to her apartment, grappling with a reality she had never expected. Marcus paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard, and took a deep breath. He knew that confronting the issue head-on would be difficult, that it might alienate some of the tenants who had grown comfortable with the status quo. But he also knew that it was the right thing to do. He closed the laptop and turned back to the window, letting his thoughts settle. Outside, the city stretched out before him, bathed in the late morning light. It was a city that had taught him resilience, patience, and the strength to keep pushing forward, even when the path was uncertain. And as he looked out over the streets that had shaped him, he felt a renewed sense of determination. He would face whatever came next, and he would do it with the same calm resolve that had carried him through every challenge before. Because if there was one thing he believed in, it was the power of change and the possibility that even the most entrenched beliefs could be transformed. The days following the confrontation were filled with a tense, electric energy, like the charged air before a storm. Rumors of what had transpired between Marcus and Helen swirled among the residents, carried in hushed tones through hallways and across the courtyard. People exchanged glances in the lobby, trying to piece together the truth, but the details remained murky. All they knew was that something significant had happened, something that had the potential to change the balance of power in the building. For Helen, the aftermath was like navigating a waking nightmare. She avoided the lobby whenever she could, slipping out the back entrance to avoid encountering Marcus or any of the residents who might have heard about her humiliation. She barely slept, her mind looping through the encounter with Marcus, replaying the moment George had revealed his ownership of the building. It felt like a wound that refused to heal, each memory opening it anew. She had always prided herself on her status as a longtime resident, someone who understood the building's history, who knew the right people, who belonged. Now she felt as if the foundations beneath her had crumbled, leaving her scrambling to find solid ground. It was a new and deeply uncomfortable sensation, and she resented Marcus for being the cause of it. But even as she stewed in her anger and shame, Helen couldn't ignore the changes unfolding around her. Marcus had wasted no time in pushing forward with his vision for the building. He sent out a carefully worded email to all residents, inviting them to a meeting in the common room. The email outlined new building guidelines that emphasized respect and inclusivity, making clear that discrimination of any kind would not be tolerated. The email was polite but firm, its tone carrying an authority that left no room for negotiation. It spoke of creating a community where everyone felt welcome, where neighbors treated each other with dignity, regardless of their backgrounds. It was the kind of message that, on the surface, seemed reasonable and progressive. But Helen couldn't shake the feeling that it was aimed directly at her, a way of turning her private embarrassment into a public statement. In the days leading up to the meeting, Marcus moved with a quiet determination, working behind the scenes to prepare for the changes he envisioned. He coordinated with his lawyer to finalize the legal aspects of the new guidelines, ensuring that they were enforceable. He also reached out to a local diversity and inclusion consultant, hoping to bring in an expert who could help facilitate the transition and make the building's new direction feel genuine rather than impose. For Marcus, the changes were about more than just enforcing rules. He saw them as an opportunity to build the kind of community he had always dreamed of, one where people could see beyond the surface, where the walls of prejudice and division might begin to crack. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and he knew that some residents would resist, but he believed that if he could show them a different way of living together, they might surprise him. On the evening of the meeting, the common room buzzed with energy. It was a space that Marcus had taken care to maintain. A large room with high ceilings, old oak floors, and tall windows that looked out onto the courtyard. A fireplace sat at one end, its mantel decorated with a few carefully chosen art pieces from local artists. The room had always been underused, a place where residents passed through without stopping. Tonight, it was filled with folding chairs arranged in a circle, creating a sense of openness and equality. Helen arrived early, slipping into a chair near the back of the room, hoping to remain unnoticed. She had debated whether to come at all, but curiosity and a stubborn sense of pride had won out. She folded her arms across her chest, watching as more residents filed in. Richard Young, the retired banker, gave her a tight-lipped nod as he took a seat nearby, but others seemed to avoid her gaze. Clara entered a few minutes later, her young daughter in tow, and settled into a chair closer to the front. When Marcus finally entered, the room fell into a tense silence. He wore a simple blazer over a button-down shirt, His posture relaxed, but his expression serious. He moved to the center of the circle and looked around, meeting each person's eyes before he spoke. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "I know there's been a lot of talk about what's been happening in the building lately, and I appreciate you taking the time to come together and discuss it. I believe that 127 Maple Avenue has the potential to be more than just a place where we live. It can be a community, a place where we support each other and treat each other with respect." He paused, letting his words sink in. Helen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, feeling the weight of his gaze passing over her. "In the past few weeks, I've seen things that remind me of why I bought this building in the first place," Marcus continued. "But I've also seen things that need to change. That's why I'm introducing a new set of guidelines for how we interact as neighbors. This isn't just about rules. It's about creating a space where every person here feels safe and valued, no matter where they come from or what they look like." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few printed copies of the guidelines, passing them around the circle. Helen took one with reluctant hands, scanning the bullet points. They included commitments to maintaining a respectful environment, protocols for handling conflicts, and plans for regular community events to foster connection. The room was quiet as the residents read through the document. Then, as Marcus had expected, the questions began. Richard raised his hand first, his expression wary. "This all sounds good in theory, Marcus," he said, "but do you really think people are going to change just because there's a new set of rules?" Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I know it's not going to happen overnight," he replied, "and I'm not expecting perfection. But I believe that if we set a standard, if we make an effort to understand each other, we can start to change the culture of this building." Clara spoke up next, her voice more hopeful. "I think it's a great idea, honestly. It's been hard feeling like I don't really know my neighbors, like we're all just living in separate bubbles. If this helps us get to know each other better, I'm all for it." A murmur of agreement rippled through a few of the residents, but Helen could feel a knot of resistance tightening in her chest. She could tell that many of them were looking at Marcus as if he were some kind of savior, but she couldn't shake the sense that this was all aimed at making her the villain. She raised her hand, and Marcus acknowledged her with a nod. Helen took a deep breath, gathering her resolve. "It seems to me," she said, her voice brittle, "that all of this is more about your ideas of what's right than about what the rest of us want. Why should you get to decide how we live here?" A few heads turned in her direction, and Marcus met her gaze evenly. "I'm not trying to impose my beliefs on anyone," he replied, "but as the owner, I do have a responsibility to ensure that everyone here is treated fairly. And I think that means creating a space where people don't have to worry about being judged for who they are." Helen's cheeks flushed with anger, but before she could respond, Clara interjected. "I don't think it's about control, Helen. It's about making sure people like me, like my daughter, feel like we belong here too." Helen glanced at Clara, seeing the determination in her eyes, and for a moment, she felt a pang of something like shame. But the feeling was quickly swallowed by her pride, and she pressed her lips together, saying nothing more. The rest of the meeting continued with more questions and discussion, but the underlying tension was clear. Marcus knew that the changes he was proposing would not be universally welcomed, but he also sensed that there was a willingness among many residents to try, to give this new approach a chance. And as the meeting drew to a close, he felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward together. For Helen, the meeting marked a turning point, but not in the way Marcus had hoped. She left the common room that night seething with frustration, her mind racing with thoughts of how unfair it all seemed. As she walked through the darkened hallways, the whispers of neighbors lingered in her ears, and she couldn't shake the sense that she was being judged, scrutinized, even ganged up on. Back in her apartment, she paced the floor, replaying the meeting in her mind. She could still see the way Clara had looked at her, the hint of pity in her eyes as if Helen were some relic from a bygone era. And Marcus had spoken with such certainty, such confidence, as if he knew what was best for everyone. It infuriated her. She began to gather her allies, reaching out to a few of the older residents she knew shared her discomfort with the changes. Richard, ever the pragmatist, listened to her arguments with a furrowed brow, but he seemed reluctant to take a strong stance. "I get what you're saying, Helen," he said when she visited him one afternoon, But it's not like Marcus is being unreasonable. I mean, sure, the new rules are a bit much, but he's just trying to make things better. Helen's hands clenched into fists, frustration bubbling over. Better for who? She snapped. He's turning this place into some kind of experiment. We've been living here for years, Richard. Why should we have to change just because he thinks he knows better? Richard shifted uncomfortably in his armchair, glancing toward the window as if seeking an escape. Look, I don't like being told what to do any more than you do, he said finally. But maybe he's got a point. I've seen the way people treat Clara and some of the newer folks. Maybe it's time we tried something different. Helen left Richard's apartment feeling more isolated than ever. She had expected him to be on her side, but now she realized that even those she thought of as allies were starting to question the old ways. It left her feeling cornered, like an animal trapped in a shrinking space. Her attempts to rally others fared no better. Mrs. Bennet, though sympathetic to Helen's discomfort with change, expressed a cautious optimism about Marcus's plans. I've seen a lot of people come and go from this building, she told Helen over tea one afternoon. And I've seen what happens when people close themselves off to each other. Maybe this is the shakeup we need. Helen felt her anger deepen into a simmering resentment. As the weeks passed, she found herself avoiding the common areas, retreating into the safety of her apartment. But even there, she couldn't escape the changes. She heard the sounds of new activities filtering through her walls, laughter from the children's playgroup that Marcus had helped organize, conversations between neighbors who hadn't spoken before. The building, it seemed, was shifting around her, leaving her behind. As Marcus continued to implement the new guidelines, he arranged for a follow-up meeting, hoping to build on the momentum of the first. He had spent weeks working with the diversity consultant, planning a series of workshops and events designed to help residents understand each other's perspectives. He knew that not everyone would participate willingly, but he believed that if he could create a space where people felt heard, they might be willing to give change a chance. But the night before the meeting, Marcus received an email from his lawyer that shifted his focus. It was a message confirming that he had the legal grounds to evict tenants who violated the new guidelines, including those who created a hostile environment for others. It was a measure he had hoped to avoid using, but as he read through the details, he realized that it gave him leverage he hadn't fully considered. When the night of the meeting arrived, the common room was filled once more, though this time the atmosphere was even more charged. Marcus could see the mix of curiosity, skepticism, and hope on the faces of the residents. Helen, as usual, sat near the back, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression guarded. Marcus began by reviewing the progress they had made in the past few weeks. He spoke about the positive changes he had seen, new friendships forming, a sense of openness that had started to take hold. But he also acknowledged the challenges, the tensions that were still simmered beneath the surface. Then he turned to Helen, meeting her gaze with a steady resolve. "There's something I need to address directly," he said, his voice taking on a firmer tone. "It's come to my attention that not everyone here feels safe and respected, and that's something I cannot tolerate. As the owner of this building, I have a responsibility to ensure that this is a place where everyone is treated with dignity." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a letter, holding it up for the room to see. "This letter outlines the steps I'm prepared to take to protect that vision," he continued, "and that includes making changes to who is welcome here." A hush fell over the room, and Helen felt her chest tighten. She stared at the letter, her mind racing with the implications. Marcus wasn't just talking about ideas. He was talking about consequences, about decisions that could change her life in a way she hadn't expected. Marcus lowered the letter, his expression unyielding. "I don't want to take drastic action," he said. "I'd much rather see us find a way to come together, to learn from each other. But I need everyone here to understand that this isn't just about me. It's about all of us, and the kind of place we want this building to be." Helen's face flushed with anger and fear, and she stood up abruptly, unable to stay silent any longer. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice trembling with frustration. "You think you can just come in and tell us how to live? You think you have the right to decide who belongs here?" Marcus met her outburst with calm, though his eyes held a steely resolve. "I'm not deciding who belongs, Helen," he said quietly. "I'm deciding what kind of behavior is acceptable. And I believe that everyone here deserves to live without fear of being judged or excluded. The silence that followed was suffocating, stretching out until Helen finally turned and stormed out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. The remaining residents exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to make of the scene they had just witnessed. Marcus took a deep breath, letting the tension settle before he spoke again. "This isn't the outcome I wanted," he admitted, "but I believe it's the right one. And I hope that together we can move forward and make this building a place where everyone feels welcome." As the meeting concluded, Marcus watched the residents begin to disperse, their faces thoughtful and uncertain. He knew that he had made a difficult choice, but he also knew that it was a necessary one. And as he returned to his apartment that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the hardest battles were still to come. Days after the tense meeting, the building felt like a pressure cooker waiting to burst. Conversations in the hallways grew quieter, the usual small talk replaced by a wary silence. Marcus knew that his decision to draw a line in the sand had sent shockwaves through the community. He could see the uncertainty in the faces of his neighbors. The young couple on the second floor who often left notes on each other's doors. Clara and her little daughter, even Richard, who had spent years insisting that he didn't care much about what went on beyond his apartment. The email from his lawyer, confirming the legality of enforcing the new rules, sat open on Marcus's laptop. He knew he had the authority to remove Helen if she continued to violate the standards he had set. Yet as he paced the length of his living room, his mind kept returning to the expression on her face when she'd stormed out of the meeting: confusion, anger, but also something that looked a lot like fear. The next morning, Marcus decided to try a different approach. He drafted a short message and slipped it under Helen's door. It was an invitation to meet with him privately in the common room, to discuss what had happened and explore a potential path forward. He made it clear that he was willing to consider alternatives to eviction, but only if Helen was prepared to have an honest conversation about her actions. He half expected her to ignore the note, but that afternoon she surprised him by appearing in the common room at the appointed time. She looked tired, her usually impeccable makeup slightly smudged, her expression guarded. She hovered by the doorway as if unsure whether she was truly welcome. Marcus gestured toward one of the chairs, offering a polite but reserved smile. "Thanks for agreeing to meet with me, Helen," he said, his tone even. "I know things have been difficult, and I thought it might help if we had a chance to talk one-on-one." Helen's arms were folded tightly across her chest, but she nodded and took a seat, her posture rigid. "I don't see what there is to talk about, Marcus," she replied, her voice brittle. "You made your point loud and clear at that meeting. It seems like you've already decided what you think of me." Marcus leaned forward slightly, clasping his hands together. "It's not about what I think of you, Helen," he said. "It's about what kind of community we want this building to be. And right now it feels like we're on opposite sides of that. But I'd like to see if we can find a way to change that. If you're willing." Helen looked at him skeptically, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faintest trace of hope. "And what exactly do you want from me?" she asked, her tone laced with suspicion. "You've made it clear that I don't fit into your vision." Marcus took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "I want to offer you a chance to stay, but it comes with conditions. I'd like you to participate in a restorative justice process with me and some of the other residents. It's not about punishment, it's about understanding what went wrong and how we can all move forward together." Helen stared at him, her disbelief palpable. "You think I'm going to sit in a circle and hold hands with the people who've been judging me since this whole mess started? Why should I put myself through that?" "Because it's better than the alternative," Marcus replied, his voice firm but not unkind. "You have a chance to show people that you're more than what they've seen so far, to prove that you're willing to grow, to listen, and I'm willing to do the same. But if you're not interested, I'll have to go forward with the eviction. I don't want to do that, Helen, but I will if I have to." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Helen looked away, her jaw clenched tightly, and for a long moment, Marcus thought she might refuse. But then with a heavy sigh, she met his gaze again, her shoulders slumping. "All right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it, but I'm not promising that it's going to change anything." Marcus nodded, feeling a small swell of relief. That's all I ask, Helen. Let's just take it one step at a time. The restorative justice sessions began quietly, held in the common room on Thursday evenings, when most of the residents were home from work. Marcus invited a few neighbors to join: Clara, Richard, Mrs. Bennett, and a couple of younger tenants who had moved in recently. They sat in a circle of folding chairs, a small table in the center holding coffee, tea, and a plate of homemade cookies that Mrs. Bennett insisted on bringing each week. Helen arrived for the first session with her usual defensive air, her lips pressed into a thin line. But she was outnumbered, surrounded by neighbors who looked at her not with hostility, but with a kind of wary curiosity. Marcus began the session by explaining what they hoped to achieve: a space where they could share their experiences honestly, where they could try to understand each other's perspectives without judgment. Clara spoke first, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. She talked about moving into the building with her daughter, the sense of isolation she had felt when she realized that some of her neighbors saw her as different, as an outsider. She spoke about the glances she received when she brought groceries up the stairs, the feeling of being judged without a word being spoken. Helen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding Clara's gaze. She wanted to dismiss Clara's story, to tell herself that it had nothing to do with her. But something about the way Clara spoke so quietly, so earnestly, made it difficult to turn away. It's not that I think everyone is like that, Clara said, glancing around the circle. But it's hard, you know? It's hard feeling like you always have to prove that you belong, that you're not a burden. I guess I just wish people would see me for who I am, not for what they assume about me. Helen swallowed, feeling a tightness in her chest. She thought of all the times she had watched Clara pass by in the hallway, her expression distant, her thoughts filled with judgments she had never bothered to question. It wasn't a comfortable realization, and she found herself staring at her hands, unable to meet Clara's eyes. The sessions continued over the following weeks, and little by little, Helen began to participate more openly. At first, she spoke hesitantly, reluctant to reveal too much of herself, but gradually she started to share her own stories, memories from her childhood, her father's strict beliefs about who was and wasn't acceptable, the way those beliefs had shaped her understanding of the world. I grew up being told that people like me needed to stick with our own kind, she admitted one evening, her voice rough with the effort of saying the words aloud. My father, he always said that letting people in would just invite trouble. I guess I never thought to question that, even after he was gone. Richard, who had been listening quietly, spoke up for the first time. You know, Helen, I remember when my parents used to say the same kind of things, about who we should trust, who we should keep at arm's length. I think a lot of us grew up with that. But the world's changed since then. We have to change with it, or we're just holding ourselves back. Helen looked at him, startled by the empathy in his voice. She had expected Richard to take her side, to agree with her complaints about Marcus's rules, but instead he had offered her something she hadn't known she needed: understanding, mixed with a gentle challenge to do better. That night, as she walked back to her apartment, Helen thought about what Richard had said. She thought about Clara's story, about the way Marcus had spoken of his own experiences with prejudice, and for the first time, she found herself wondering if there was a way to break free from the habits that had defined her for so long. As winter turned to spring, the sessions began to feel less like confrontations and more like conversations. Helen still struggled with her old instincts. There were moments when she felt the urge to snap back at Clara or defend herself against perceived slights. But each time, she caught herself, remembering Marcus's words about the possibility of change. One evening, Marcus asked Helen to stay after the session had ended, after the other residents had left the common room with their leftover cookies and empty teacups. Helen stayed behind, folding the chairs with stiff, uncertain movements, unsure of what Marcus wanted to discuss. When the last chair was put away, Marcus leaned against the edge of the table, studying Helen with a thoughtful expression. I've been watching how you've been participating in the sessions, Helen, he said, his voice calm but serious. And I have to say, I'm impressed by how far you've come. Helen looked at him warily, not sure if he was setting her up for another reprimand. I'm just doing what you asked, she replied, her tone cautious. I'm not sure it's made much of a difference. Marcus shook his head. It's made a difference whether you see it or not. I can tell that you're trying, and that's not easy, especially when you've spent so long seeing the world a certain way." He paused, meeting her gaze directly. "But I think you need to hear this, Helen. The work you're doing now, it's important, but it doesn't erase the hurt that you caused before. It doesn't undo the damage of all those years. You need to be willing to face that, to accept that the road to redemption isn't a straight line." Helen felt a lump rise in her throat, her eyes burning with the sting of unspoken regrets. She wanted to lash out, to tell Marcus that he didn't know what it was like to unlearn a lifetime of beliefs. But she held her tongue, feeling the weight of his words settle deep inside her. "Why are you telling me this, Marcus?" she asked finally, her voice unsteady. "Why give me a chance if you think I can't ever make up for what I've done?" Marcus's expression softened, and for a moment, Helen saw a glimpse of the weariness he carried beneath his calm exterior. "Because I believe in second chances, Helen," he said quietly. "I've been given a few in my own life, and I know how much they matter. But I also know that second chances don't come without accountability. You have to earn them." He pushed away from the table and crossed the room, retrieving a small box from one of the storage cabinets. He handed it to Helen, a simple gesture, but it felt like the passing of a baton. She opened the box and found a stack of sign-up sheets for a community cleanup event Marcus was planning, as well as flyers for a new cultural festival that he hoped would bring more of the neighborhood together. "I want you to help me with this," Marcus said, nodding toward the contents of the box. "Help me organize these events. It's a chance for you to show everyone that you're committed to building something better, for yourself and for the people who live here." Helen looked down at the flyers, her hands trembling slightly. For a moment, she felt the old voice inside her rise up, telling her that this wasn't her job, that she didn't owe anyone anything. But then she thought of the conversations she'd had with Clara, with Richard, with Marcus. She thought of the loneliness that had plagued her since she had been forced to confront her own actions. "All right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it. I'll help you." Marcus gave her a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, Helen. This could be the beginning of something good, for all of us." The following weeks brought a slow but steady transformation, both for Helen and for the building. With Marcus's encouragement, Helen threw herself into the preparations for the community cleanup day. She made phone calls to local businesses, gathering donations of supplies, and spent her afternoons canvassing the neighborhood with Clara, handing out flyers and spreading the word. At first, many of the neighbors regarded her efforts with skepticism. Some of them still remembered the way she had spoken to Marcus in the lobby, the way she had dismissed Clara's concerns at the first meeting. But as they saw her putting her in the work, their attitudes began to shift. On the morning of the cleanup, Helen arrived in the courtyard early, setting up tables with gloves, trash bags, and refreshments. Clara joined her, carrying a tray of homemade muffins, and together they worked in companionable silence, the awkwardness between them gradually giving way to a sense of shared purpose. The event was a modest success. Dozens of residents turned out to help, filling bags with litter, sweeping the sidewalks, and planting new flowers in the courtyard. Helen moved among them, offering thanks and encouragement, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of pride in being part of something larger than herself. As the day wound down, Marcus approached her, his face alight with satisfaction. "You did great today, Helen," he said, handing her a cup of lemonade. "You've shown everyone that you're serious about making a change." Helen took the cup, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the lemonade. "Thank you, Marcus," she replied, meeting his gaze. "I still have a long way to go, but I'm starting to see things differently. I think I'm starting to see myself differently, too." Marcus nodded, his smile growing softer. "That's all any of us can hope for, Helen. Just keep moving forward." As they stood together, watching the last of the residents head back to their apartments, Helen felt a sense of hope she hadn't known in years. It wasn't a perfect feeling. There were still doubts, still moments of discomfort, but she knew that she was no longer alone, that she was part of a community that believed in the possibility of change, and for the first time, she believed it too. Spring arrived at 127 Maple Avenue with a sense of renewal in the air. The courtyard, once stark and empty, was now blooming with vibrant tulips and freshly planted shrubs. Helen found herself lingering outside more often, helping Clara and her daughter with the community garden they had started together. The whispers about her had quieted over time, replaced by the occasional smile or nod of acknowledgement from her neighbors. But just as the building seemed to be finding its new rhythm, disaster struck in the form of a broken water main. One morning, Marcus woke to frantic texts from George, the security guard, describing how water was gushing into the basement, flooding the storage area, and threatening to seep into the first-floor apartments. Marcus hurried downstairs, finding George ankle-deep in water, trying to direct a crew of emergency repair workers who had just arrived. The damage was severe. Pipes would need to be replaced, the basement would require extensive drying, and the power would need to be shut off in parts of the building for at least a week. Marcus spent the next few hours making phone calls to plumbers and contractors, coordinating with the city to ensure the work could begin as quickly as possible. As he surveyed the scene, he realized that this was more than just a logistical challenge. It was a test of the community they had worked so hard to build. Many of the residents would be without heat or hot water for days. Some, like Mrs. Bennett, wouldn't be able to manage without assistance, and families like Clara's would need temporary arrangements. Marcus knew he couldn't handle this alone. He needed to rely on others, and he needed to see if the changes they had fought for in the past months could withstand a real crisis. In the late afternoon, as workers labored to pump out the water, Marcus found Helen in the lobby, where she was speaking with Clara and Richard. He could see the concern in her eyes, but also a quiet determination. "Helen," Marcus called, striding over to join the group. "I could use your help with this. We need to organize temporary housing for the people on the first floor, and we have to make sure the older residents have what they need. Are you up for it?" Helen hesitated, glancing at the chaos of repair workers and anxious tenants. The old voice in her head whispered that this wasn't her problem, that she should let someone else handle it. But she pushed that thought aside, remembering the promises she had made, not only to Marcus but to herself. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. "Tell me what needs to be done." Over the next few hours, Helen coordinated with the affected residents, helping them move essential belongings to other parts of the building. She made phone calls to local shelters and hotels, securing a few temporary rooms for those who needed a safe place to stay. She worked closely with Clara to set up a makeshift kitchen in the common room, serving hot drinks and simple meals to the neighbors who gathered there to escape the cold. The work was exhausting, but for Helen, it was also strangely fulfilling. She moved through the hallways with a new sense of purpose, no longer worrying about who might judge her or dismiss her efforts. She focused instead on what she could do, on the small acts of kindness that slowly added up to something greater. At one point, as she helped Mrs. Bennett settle into a temporary room on the third floor, the older woman caught her hand and squeezed it gently. "Thank you, Helen," she said, her voice trembling. "You've done so much to help us. I always knew there was more to you than you let on." Helen felt a lump form in her throat and she managed a shaky smile. "I'm just trying to do what's right, Mrs. Bennett. It's about time I started." Mrs. Bennett nodded, her eyes misty. "Well, you've made a believer out of me, dear." By the time the sun set, the repair work was underway, and most of the displaced residents had been settled into temporary quarters. Helen returned to the common room, where Marcus was poring over plans with the lead contractor. He looked up as she approached, a tired but grateful expression on his face. "You've done an incredible job, Helen," he said, handing her a cup of coffee. "I don't know how we would have managed without you." Helen accepted the coffee, feeling a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the drink. "I couldn't have done it alone," she replied, glancing at Clara, who was setting out blankets for some of the children playing nearby. "We all had to pull together." Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's what community is all about, isn't it? It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to show up, even when things are hard." Helen looked around the room, taking in the sight of her neighbors laughing together, sharing stories, and helping one another through the crisis. It was a scene she never would have imagined when she first moved into the building, when she had clung so tightly to her ideas of who belonged and who didn't. And now, as she stood beside Marcus, she realized that this was the community she had always wanted, one that welcomed her as she was, flaws and all. By the end of the week, the repairs were nearly complete, and life at 127 Maple Avenue began to return to normal. The emergency had brought the residents closer, forging new connections and deepening old ones. Clara's daughter now played regularly with the children from the first floor, while Richard had taken to organizing card games in the common room with a few of the newer residents. Helen, too, found herself becoming a more active part of the building's social life. She attended the potlucks that Marcus hosted, where neighbors gathered to share dishes from their cultures, and she joined the committee planning the summer block party that Marcus had envisioned. She still had moments when she felt out of place, when the old insecurities rose up, whispering that she didn't truly belong. But she had learned to push past those doubts, to focus instead on the new friendships she was building. One evening, as the last of the construction equipment was cleared from the basement and the building began to hum with the warmth of restored heat, Marcus called a meeting in the common room. The residents gathered once more, filling the space with their usual mix of curiosity and expectation. But this time, the atmosphere was different, warmer, more open. Marcus stood before them, his expression serious but kind. "I want to thank all of you for your patience during this crisis," he began, his voice carrying easily over the crowd. "It hasn't been easy, but I think we've shown what we're capable of when we work together. This building has always been more than just a place to live. It's a community, and that's because of each and every one of you." He paused, letting his words sink in, then turned to Helen, who was seated near the front. "I especially want to thank Helen, who stepped up in ways I never expected. She's shown that she's willing to put in the work, to be a part of what we're building here, and I hope you'll join me in recognizing her efforts." A ripple of applause filled the room, and Helen felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and pride. She had never imagined herself in this position, receiving the approval of her neighbors, the same people she had once regarded with suspicion and distance. She caught Clara's eye, seeing the warm smile on her face, and felt a surge of gratitude for the second chance she had been given. After the meeting, as the residents lingered to chat and share stories, Marcus approached Helen with a smile. "You've come a long way, Helen," he said, his voice warm with sincerity. "I hope you're starting to see what I saw in you all along." Helen swallowed the lump in her throat, struggling to find the right words. "I still don't know if I deserve all this kindness," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm trying to be better. I'm trying to earn it." Marcus nodded, a thoughtful look in his eyes. "It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to change, even when it's hard. And I think you've done that." Helen managed a small, shaky smile. "Thank you, Marcus, for giving me the chance." They stood together for a moment, watching as the residents shared a potluck meal in the common room, the laughter and chatter filling the space with a warmth that had been missing for so long. It was a scene that spoke of new beginnings, of a building that had learned to grow together, even through hardship. A few weeks later, as spring turned to early summer, the block party that Helen and Marcus had planned together finally took place. The courtyard was filled with music, the scent of barbecue drifting through the air as neighbors mingled and children ran between tables. Marcus watched from the edges, letting himself enjoy the sight of the community they had built together. Helen moved among the guests with a new sense of ease, laughing with Mrs. Bennet, trading recipes with Clara, even joining in a game of cards with Richard. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the scene, she found herself standing beside Marcus near the garden they had planted together. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, her voice quiet but filled with genuine awe. I never thought I'd be a part of something like this." Marcus turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I think you've always had it in you, Helen. You just needed to believe it yourself." She met his gaze, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe he was right. That maybe she had found a place where she truly belonged. Summer settled over 127 Maple Avenue, bringing with it a sense of peace and possibility. The repairs from the flood had long since been completed, and the building thrummed with a new energy, its residents more connected than ever before. Clara's daughter played in the courtyard garden, her laughter mingling with the buzz of city life. Marcus looked from his office window, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The block party had been a success, but more importantly, it marked a turning point for the building. Helen's transformation, once so uncertain, had become a symbol of what they could achieve together, a reminder that change was possible, even for those who seem most set in their ways. For Marcus, the journey wasn't over. He continued to work with other property owners in the neighborhood, sharing his experiences and helping to foster similar changes beyond the walls of 127 Maple. He believed that the lessons they had learned could serve as a model, a way of showing that community was built not through perfect people, but through the willingness to face flaws and keep moving forward. And for Helen, life had taken on a new sense of purpose. She still had moments of doubt, but she had learned to quiet them with the knowledge that she was capable of growth. She had become an integral part of the building's life, helping to plan events, checking in on her neighbors, and offering a helping hand where it was needed. She still thought of herself as a work in progress, but she had come to see that there was strength in that, a strength she had never known before. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Marcus and Helen stood together in the courtyard, watching the lights of Boston flicker to life. Helen turned to Marcus, raising a glass of lemonade. "To second chances," she said, a smile in her voice. Marcus clinked his glass against hers, his smile warm with pride. "To second chances," he echoed, "and to the people who make them possible." As they stood together, surrounded by the community they had helped to build, they knew that the story of 127 Maple Avenue was far from over. It was a story that would continue to grow, to change, to welcome new voices into its fold. And it was a story that had shown them both that the power of transformation lay not just in the grand gestures, but in the quiet, steady work of becoming better, together. If you were moved by this story of redemption, second chances, and the power of community, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Here on Tales of Change, we believe in bringing you stories that challenge perspectives and remind us of the strength that lies in every individual. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. Each one a reminder that transformation is always possible. Leave a like if this story resonated with you and share your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep the conversation going, because just like at 127 Maple Avenue, every voice matters here.